Hello and welcome back to issue 17 of our tutorial series of making airports with WET for X-Plane. And today's subject will be the mysterious airport aircraft AI flows. And we're getting lots and lots of questions about these on the forums. I'm not the 100% total expert on how these work, but I'll try to pass on what little I know about the flows to you in this video. We only have an airport with a single runway, which normally does not warrant making flows because when there's only one single runway, if X-Plane doesn't find a flow at your airport, it will just assume that you want to operate all aircraft into the wind. So this is probably what you want to do. If you have more than one runway or even parallel runways and you want to segregate your traffic, fast one on one and the slow one on the other, or heavy on one and light on the other, also on, then making a flow makes sense. And the next thing to know is that the taxi routings that we laid down here have nothing to do really with the flow. You need a control tower frequency on your airport to have AI aircraft. I mentioned that already. We don't on this airport, but we could change this to tower and then it would work. But for the purpose of demonstrating how to make flows, this is not necessary. So I'll leave this on common traffic advisory frequency. And what you do want to have is probably have the correct frequency for the approach or departure ATC service that services your airport because you want to add that to the flow information later on. So this is a good time to check the ATC tab here and check that your frequencies are correct with some real world charts. And let's assume that they are. And we are going to add a second runway just to make this a little more interesting. And I'm just going to make it go across here. Now this is our runway 1028. Also remember that the runways have to be big, wide and long enough for the desired aircraft to use them. You can't operate jumbo jets on the small airport like that. X-Plane will simply refuse to land them there. Also, you need to have the specific size of ramp starts on your airport. Otherwise, again, X-Plane won't land your aircraft there. And that needs to be satisfied to test your flows and to make them work, but to actually make the flows, this is not necessary. So we can just go ahead now and I'll show you what little I know about the flows. Now, the flows, to make them, you need to select the airport itself. WET supports having multiple airports in one project, so you need to tell WET which airport you want to make the flow for. And then when you click on airport, you can see the create airport flow is not grayed out anymore. You click on that, you get an unnamed ATC flow. And I usually make my flows, I call them for the flow direction. This one I would maybe call, if you have 4 runways and you also want to always want to make them operate into the wind, I would call this maybe the northerly flow. And for the northerly flow, you have to specify, you can see the properties down here, you specify which ICAO, which airport or weather reporting station X-Plane should check to see if the flow is valid. And of course, if it's a bigger airport, they have their own weather forecast, so to say, their own meteorological airport report or aerodrome report. And I assume that KTTA has one. If you have a really small airport, you just enter the 4-letter code of the next bigger airport, and then the weather, if it's not too far away, should be valid for your little aerodrome as well. And you also have a minimum ceiling and a minimum visibility to make this flow valid. Now, always remember that when X-Plane checks if the flow is valid, it checks if the ceiling is 0 feet or better. Same with the wind. Later on, we'll add wind. If you put in 90 knots, it will say, is the wind 90 knots or better? Better means better in the sense of the pilot. The pilots like little winds, so 90 or less is valid. And the same here with the ceiling. Pilots like high ceilings or no ceilings at all. So 0 feet also 1,000 feet or 10,000 feet, that would all be valid. If you put in a 1,000 here, then a 500-foot ceiling would be worse and it would not be valid anymore. But since we for now don't want to make different flows that depend on the ceilings, we'll just leave that at 0 and 0. And for a northerly flow, the pattern runway 03 would be great because that is into the wind. The pattern runway is really nothing that X-Plane uses yet. I think they may do later on when they add VFR traffic, but for now, this isn't really used at all. You can put in here whatever you want because we'll specify which runway to use in the case of the northerly flow later on. But to make it compatible with future versions of X-Planes, I always make it a point to put in the correct runway here and also have a pattern direction that makes sense. If you don't know any better, then a left-hand pattern is good, but maybe there's a village over here which you don't want to have them overfly later on, or you know that the pattern direction for this airport would be right, then you could change it to right. Now that we added the flow, we can also add the runway wind rule that this flow should apply for, and you don't have to change the name. X-Plane will do this automatically for you. You'll see in a second. And we say if they're using runway 03, then we would say the wind is coming from, well, maybe it's coming from, you can do whatever you want here, but we'll say 350, which is about 40 degrees off to the left, and then 40 degrees off to the right would be 070. And we would say whenever the wind is, well, we want all winds to be covered, and you can't put in 999 here. Well, I guess you can. You can just put in 1,000 knots. So whenever the wind is less than 1,000 knots coming from this direction, then this runway will be used. It's important to know that X-Plane will never close an airport. Even if the wind was 1,001 knots, then this rule wouldn't apply anymore. It would just keep going down to find a rule that applies. And if it doesn't find a rule that applies, it will simply assume that you have not made any rules, any flows at all, and then it will just use the runway that is into the wind the most. X-Plane doesn't close airports, neither for wind nor for visibility or low ceiling. So you can, set up different flows or different rules for low visibility operations and so on. I'll show you how to in a second. But for now, this doesn't, they will never close an airport. Now, the second rule that you can set up here is a time rule. And I never really use this, but you could, if you know, for example, that during the daylight hours they like to use runway 03, and at nighttime they like to use runway 10, then you could do that. You can say, well, starting at 10 Zulu until maybe 1400 Zulu, they use the northerly flow. And now that we're done with having all the preconditions for this flow set, the ceiling, the visibility, the wind, direction and speed, and the time, now we're finally going to tell X-Plane which runway to use. And now we put in a runway use. They call it runway 03 because I guess it's the pattern runway is already that, but you can change that, of course. We could tell them use runway 28. It wouldn't make any sense because we call it the northerly flow, but you could. If you wanted to, you can say use runway 28. But basically, the way it works, X-Plane is simple. It will just go down the list and it will check valid, valid, valid. If so, then yes, now I'm going to look at the runway use rules, and you can have several use rules in your flow. We'll make another one, and just to show you how it works. And this one will say, hey, runway 03 we'll use for the landings. Landings are more critical to the wind, so maybe on northerly flows we want to have operations arrivals on runway 03, and we want now set the traffic types. If you want all the arrivals to go there, you would have to click all these, but maybe you just want the props, the helicopters, and the jets, and the rest is okay to land on a different runway. So we'll just say arrivals, these ones. We'll just make a copy of this one really quick. Edit, duplicate in place, and we say the other arrivals should be on runway maybe 10, and now we want the heavy jets and the fighters to arrive on that one, but not these ones anymore. See, now we created two arrival rules, arrival runway 03, arrival 10, and we segregated our traffic. The one is for heavy jets and fighters, and this one is for jets, turboprops, and helicopters. Doesn't make sense because we would probably all want them to land into the wind, but you get the idea. You can now create many different runway rules. This one would be runway 03, and we also want departures to be possible. So we'll say on runway 03, we want departures. And again, you can go totally wild. You can say, I just want the heavy jets and the props to depart on runway 03. And then I make another one. You can just duplicate this one. Sometimes it's easier than setting everything up in anew. And you can say, hey, these guys need to depart on runway 21. Again, wouldn't make any sense, but you could. And of course, X-Plane will try to allow departures going on 21 and landings on 03. It would create mayhem because these guys could never take off because planes would land. But you can go pretty wild. X-Plane doesn't check if this makes sense. You have to double and triple check your rules if they really make sense. And you can further specify, for example, if you have say departures runway 21, then now you want to add the correct departure frequency. We already said that it should be 125.3, so now you would add 125.3 because this is what ATC will tell you when you fly that. Now contact departure 125.3, it looks up this frequency right here. And there's also 4 more tabs down here. You have the, can I move this? No, but if you hover your mouse, you can see if you say we have departures on runway 03, you have a minimum ATC assigned heading. You can say maybe there's a village over here, so you don't want them to turn left. You say the minimum heading is 030, and you say the maximum heading, they can turn right, but you don't want them to interfere with runway 10, so maybe they can turn all the way to 070. So the initial heading that ATC will give them after liftoff is straight or maybe 70 degrees, depending on where they finally want to go. But it's going to be in this sector, and this makes it possible to kind of segregate traffic if you have traffic also departing from runway 10, or if there's a village here or a mountain or so, you can kind of like help the initial ATC by assigning this heading. And the minimum legal on-course heading determines which is their first fix. Maybe you say, well, all the aircraft that turn left here, the ones that go towards the west, they should use runway 03. So you say, well, the minimum legal would be 180 and the maximum legal would be 359. So all the aircraft that actually head to the west or that want to go west can use this runway, and the other ones, we have a departure runway 21. Well, these ones should all go to the east, and then you of course have to make this one north and go to 179. There you go. Now all the other ones would use runway 21. But again, if you have, see, we only specified jets, heavy jets and props here. Now if you have a helicopter that wants to go to the east, he cannot find a rule. It will just, you know, the ATC says, or the AI says, I have this helicopter, it's going to go to the east, but none of these are, this one holds true, this one holds true, this one holds true, but I can't find a runway use rule. So it will just pretend you don't have any flows at all. It will just send it to a runway of its choice. So once you start going wild with minimum legal on course and so on, you need to double and triple check, maybe draw it out on paper that it makes sense. Now that once you have the flow going, you can easily duplicate it and then say duplicate in place and then make another flow, and this one could be the westerly flow. And here you go again. Now you'd have to double check everything again. Maybe the pattern runway in a westerly flow should now be runway 28. And the wind, if the wind is coming from the west, well, it should be, this would probably be the runway that you use. So maybe the wind would go from down here to 20 to 350. So you don't want to leave any gaps. 349. This would be, I think it will always get rounded to the nearest degree, so you don't have to go 349.5 or so. Just go 349, and if the wind is from 350, then this one will apply, and we leave it at 99 knots. But of course, you see with the duplicate, you can make many flows, and you can say, well, maybe if the wind is light, you make a bunch of flows that say maximum speed 20 knots, and then you make another bunch of flows when the wind is stronger than 20 knots. Different rules apply. This is really flexible. The only thing that you can't do, and this is something I sorely miss, you cannot really assign or determine a certain tailwind component. In the real world, often airports say, well, we use runway 03 until the tailwind component exceeds 10 knots or 5 knots if it's wet. Of course, precipitation isn't reflected here, but you can't even say 10 knots. I mean, you can say, well, if the wind is 50 knots from cross, then it's still okay. If it's 10 degrees or here, then it would still be okay. But you have to do the sine function of the wind angle, and to determine once the tailwind component exceeds 10 knots, you'd have to make a million flow rules for basically every 1 degree and different wind speeds, say this is still okay, this is still okay. In theory, it's possible to make 350 rules with increasing wind or decreasing wind speed that has more of an angle from the back, but it's not practicable. So this is something that Laminar really overlooked when they came up with this system. You cannot specify a wind component on a runway, which is lacking. Anyway, if you really want to take stuff further and you have an airport with ILS runways or even low visibility runways, then of course you would make a northerly flow and call it maybe VFR. And then on the VFR flow, you would say, well, my minimum ceiling needs to be at least 1,000 feet AGL, and it needs to be at least, let's say, 1.5 statute miles. And now this one applies. And you can just copy this and let's do this, duplicate in place. And we have the northerly flow VFR, and I'm going to put it, oops, down here. And now I call this one northerly flow cat 1. And now my cat 1 flow says it's okay if the ceiling is minimum 200, at least 200, and the visibility is half a mile or better. Now in this case, I still have my wind rule, my time rule, and I would now say, okay, only 03 has an ILS, so of course I can't have any arrivals on runway 10 anymore. I cancel this one. I allow this one for all airplanes now. Basically, once the ceiling or visibility is Cat 1, then I want all the traffic to arrive on runway 03, and so on. You get the drift. You can make another set of rules just for even maybe low vis with a 50 feet ceiling and even less visibility. And basically, you'd have to remember that the AI takes an aircraft. It says, I want to land it or I want to depart it. If it's departing, it goes to this direction, and then it starts going down your rule list, and it will check if this is valid, if this is valid. Basically, every flow has to have a weather information, it has to have a wind information, and it doesn't have to have a time information. You can just remove the time information. I think you can also remove the wind information. Then of course it wouldn't make any sense to make different flows, but I normally don't mess with the time, so let's move this away. And then once these are two are satisfied, it will just keep going until it finds a set that says, it's an arrival I have here. It's a jet. Okay, this is cool. Arrival jet. Obviously, it needs to be runway 03, and then it's done. And if it cannot find anything that satisfies the conditions or that the plane it tries to operate, it will just keep going down. And if it doesn't find one, it will default to nothing, as if you hadn't made any flow at all. Experiment with that. If you have many runways, you'll get lots of validation warnings. And remember, a lot of times the warnings you can waive if there's a validation warning that you can't figure out. But normally, if you have like 4 runways, you would make a little line that splits it here, that splits it here, and you can have certain rules where you can say, hey, I can still take planes off on this one and this one if the wind is coming from here to maybe here. And then if the wind is coming from here to here, then you can take them off here and land them here, and so on. So you can even if you have crossing runways, you can use 2 at the same time, and a lot of airports have parallel runways where you either segregate the traffic for the turn direction if it's going east or west, or you can say, well, the heavy and fast planes use the long runway, and the light planes and helicopters, they can use the short runway, stuff like that. Experiment with that, look at X-Plane and see how it works out. The flows do work. They fix some bugs, but as far as I can tell, they work as intended. But remember, this is not perfect, and airports never get closed. And just keep that in mind, that if you have an airport with a very specific way it's being used in the real world, you will most likely not be able to match that with X-Plane.